Although filled with unspeakable atrocities, World War II was not without its share of blunders and bizarre tales. Perhaps the most comical among them is the story of Hitler's right-hand man, who managed the impossible. Despite being the second most powerful figure in Nazi Germany, Rudolf Hess became a British prisoner without England lifting a single finger. His capture, driven by a strange mix of idealism, delusion, and misguided loyalty, remains one of the war's most baffling episodes. To understand how Hess found himself in such an absurd situation, we first need to introduce the man behind the infamous mission. Rudolf Hess was one of the most enigmatic figures in the Nazi hierarchy, a man whose life would take an extraordinary and ultimately disastrous turn. Born on April 26, 1894, in Alexandria, Egypt, Hess came from a prosperous German merchant family. Growing up in an affluent environment, he was exposed to different cultures and languages, but his sense of identity remained firmly rooted in his German heritage. He received an education that emphasized discipline and patriotism, qualities that would shape his life and his unwavering loyalty to Germany. When World War I erupted, Hess, like many young Germans, was eager to serve. He volunteered for the infantry and saw brutal combat on the front lines. The experience left him with both physical injuries and a deep psychological impact. Later, he trained as a pilot, joining the ranks of those who saw aviation as a new frontier of warfare. This intense experience on the front solidified Hess's belief in Germany's greatness and in the righteousness of its struggle. By the end of the war, he was profoundly patriotic, disillusioned with Germany's defeat, and outraged by the Treaty of Versailles, which many Germans saw as a national humiliation. Returning to a Germany in economic and social turmoil, Hess felt adrift and frustrated. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed severe restrictions on Germany, leading to widespread poverty, resentment, and a sense of betrayal among its people. Many, like Hess, believed that Germany's honor had been unjustly trampled, and they were searching for someone who could restore it. This longing for national revival set the stage for Hess's fateful encounter with Adolf Hitler. In the early 1920s, Hess attended one of Hitler's speeches in Munich. He was immediately captivated by Hitler's passionate rhetoric and his vision for a greater Germany. To Hess, Hitler embodied the strength and purpose that Germany desperately needed, and he became one of Hitler's earliest and most devoted followers. His loyalty bordered on the fanatical, and he saw Hitler as the man destined to bring Germany back to its former glory. Hess joined the Nazi Party, committing himself to Hitler's cause with an intensity that would only deepen in the years to come. Hess quickly rose through the ranks, becoming a trusted confidant and eventually the Deputy Führer, the second highest position in the Nazi Party. He was not just a political ally to Hitler, he was, in many ways, his spiritual supporter, believing that Hitler was the leader Germany had been waiting for. Unlike other Nazi leaders who were motivated by ambition or personal gain, Hess's dedication to Hitler was almost religious. He saw himself as a vessel for Hitler's vision, working tirelessly to spread the Nazi ideology and reinforce Hitler's authority. Unlike some of his counterparts, who were deeply involved in the brutal mechanics of Nazi rule, Hess remained more focused on ideology and the purity of the party's principles. This distance from the party's daily operations allowed Hess to maintain an image of moral idealism, even as he remained loyal to the regime's brutal goals. Hess's interests in mysticism, astrology, and various philosophies gave him a peculiar role within the Nazi inner circle, often seen as the spiritual advisor who believed in a mythical destiny for Germany. By 1941, Rudolf Hess had cemented his position as Hitler's most loyal follower. His reverence for Hitler was absolute, and he believed deeply in the idea of a German destiny that could only be realized under Hitler's leadership. Yet Hess's loyalty was not without consequences. In his quest to fulfill what he saw as his duty to the nation, he began to envision himself as a mediator who could bring peace to Europe on Hitler's terms. He believed that Britain, which he saw as a natural ally against communism, could be persuaded to join Germany against the Soviet Union. Convinced that he could accomplish this, Hess would soon embark on a mission that would change the course of his life, and ultimately make him a prisoner in the very nation he sought to sway. By 1941, Europe was engulfed in the chaos and devastation of World War II. Hitler's military had seized vast territories, pushing across Western Europe with terrifying speed. France had fallen, and the Luftwaffe was relentlessly bombing London in the Battle of Britain. Meanwhile, Hitler's attention was increasingly shifting toward the Soviet Union, with plans already in motion for an invasion he dubbed Operation Barbarossa, an assault intended to crush communism and expand German territory to the east. In the midst of these high-stakes maneuvers, Hess became increasingly restless. Unlike many Nazi leaders who were consumed with military strategy or personal ambition, Hess's mind was on ideology and destiny. He was convinced that Germany's ultimate goal should be to join forces with Britain, not fight against it. Hess saw the British as a kindred people, another Aryan nation that, in his view, shared cultural and racial bonds with Germany. His vision was based on an idealistic, if naive, belief that Britain would eventually recognize a common enemy in the Soviet Union and agree to join Germany in its crusade against communism. This vision, however, was not widely shared within the Nazi high command. Hitler and his advisors were focused on conquest, not alliances. Hitler had indeed admired the British Empire and, before the war, had hoped to avoid conflict with Britain, but by 1941, any such hopes had faded. Germany and Britain were entrenched enemies, and Hitler had no plans to reach out diplomatically to London. Hess, however, was determined to find a way to bring Britain and Germany together. He began to imagine himself as a mediator, someone who could personally intervene to restore peace between the two nations. Hess believed that if he could meet with British aristocrats and influential figures sympathetic to Germany, he could convince them to pressure the British government into negotiations. He was certain that Britain would see the logic in joining forces with Germany against the Soviets. The isolation of his position only seemed to fuel Hess's ambition. His role as Hitler's deputy Führer had become more symbolic over time, leaving him removed from the practical operations of the Nazi government. He spent long hours in contemplation, poring over books on philosophy, astrology, and mysticism, searching for signs and omens that would guide him. Hess interpreted these esoteric interests as confirmation that he was destined for a unique purpose, something bigger than his current role allowed. This sense of destiny eventually took on an almost obsessive character. Despite the obvious risks, Hess believed his mission was not only logical but also necessary. He began planning a solo flight to Britain, an audacious scheme that would bypass all official channels. Hess would fly alone, in secret, to present his peace proposal directly to influential Britons. His target was the Duke of Hamilton, whom Hess believed to be sympathetic to Germany's cause. Although Hess had never met the Duke, he had heard of him through vague connections and assumed that the aristocrat would be open to peace. As Hess's vision took shape, he kept his plans hidden from almost everyone. Hitler had no knowledge of the scheme, and only a few close associates were aware of Hess's intentions, though they considered his plan too improbable to succeed. Nevertheless, Hess was convinced that his mission would be a turning point in the war, a brave and decisive act that would cement his place in history and potentially save Germany from a prolonged, multi-front conflict. Hess's preparations were meticulous, fueled by an unwavering belief in his own mission. He studied flight plans, selected a Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighter bomber, and secretly trained for the long journey across the North Sea. Every aspect of his plan was calculated and rehearsed, yet the underlying premise was deeply flawed. Britain's war stance was uncompromising, and there was little chance that a single envoy, especially a German, would alter that. Despite the unlikelihood of success, Hess's belief in his mission was unshakable. The final details were set, and on May 10, 1941, Hess set out alone, soaring into the night sky. His ambition was simple but staggering, to be the man who would broker peace between two warring nations, one of which had already branded his leader as its sworn enemy. Unbeknownst to him, this flight would mark the beginning of his fall from grace and seal his fate as one of the most unusual prisoners of the war. As night fell on May 10, 1941, Rudolf Hess embarked on what he believed would be a historic mission for peace. Alone in his Messerschmitt Bf 110, a twin-engine fighter-bomber modified for long-range travel, Hess flew into the darkness, guided only by his sense of destiny and the compass on his dashboard. The journey ahead was perilous, hundreds of miles over the North Sea, vulnerable to both British radar and unpredictable weather. Yet, Hess was undeterred. He had convinced himself that this daring flight was not only achievable but divinely ordained. The flight itself was a monumental feat of endurance and focus. Hess, not a seasoned pilot, had to rely on basic instruments and his own calculations to guide him across the sea. He had plotted a course from Augsburg, Germany, to Scotland, where he intended to meet the Duke of Hamilton. To Hess, the Duke represented the kind of British nobility he believed would understand Germany's cause and be open to peace talks. He had learned of Hamilton through various vague sources, and in his imagination, the Duke had become an almost mythical figure, someone who could sway the British government and end the war. For hours, Hess flew in near total isolation. The roar of the engines was his only companion, and with each passing mile, his determination grew. However, his plan was far from foolproof. Despite his rigorous preparations, Hess's knowledge of British air defenses and terrain was limited. He had not informed German intelligence of his plan, nor did he have diplomatic approval for such a mission. He was, quite literally, flying into enemy territory without any formal backing, relying on hope and intuition rather than solid intelligence. Eventually, as he approached the coast of Scotland, Hess was faced with a critical decision. He knew he could not land his aircraft directly without risking detection and possible interception by British forces. His only viable option was to parachute from the plane, leaving his fate to the hands of local inhabitants, whom he assumed would lead him to the Duke. With a mixture of anxiety and exhilaration, Hess turned his plane toward the designated area and prepared to jump. As he descended through the night sky, parachuting down toward a land that was both hostile and unfamiliar, Hess likely believed he was on the verge of a great diplomatic breakthrough. However, reality soon shattered his illusion. Upon landing, he found himself disoriented, injured, and at the mercy of local Scottish farmers who had no idea who he was. Far from the sympathetic reception he had imagined, Hess was met with suspicion. The locals quickly turned him over to the British authorities, who were as astonished as they were skeptical. When he identified himself as Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer of Germany, the reaction was one of disbelief. The British intelligence officers who interrogated him were initially convinced he was an imposter or mentally unstable. It seemed inconceivable that one of the highest-ranking Nazis would willingly fly into enemy territory on a self-assigned peace mission. Over the next several hours, Hess attempted to explain his motives, arguing passionately that Germany and Britain should unite against their common enemy, the Soviet Union. He spoke of Hitler's admiration for Britain and expressed his belief that the two countries could forge a powerful alliance. But his words fell on deaf ears. The British were not interested in Hess's overtures. To them, he was either a dangerous Nazi official or a delusional individual acting on an unauthorized mission. Within days, the story of Hess's bizarre flight made headlines around the world, baffling both allies and enemies alike. In Germany, Hitler was furious, labeling Hess a traitor and dismissing him as mentally unstable. British officials, on the other hand, saw Hess's mission as an opportunity to gain insight into the inner workings of the Nazi regime, though they found little of value in his rambling and erratic statements. Thus, Rudolf Hess found himself a prisoner in Britain, his grand plan reduced to an international spectacle and his role in the Nazi Party forever tainted. His solo flight, intended as a gesture of peace, had instead made him the most unexpected, and unintentional, prisoner of war. The man who once stood beside Hitler as his loyal deputy was now confined to a British cell, his dreams of diplomacy crushed by the harsh reality of war. The news of Hess's solo mission to Britain sent shockwaves through Nazi Germany. When word reached Hitler of his deputy Führer's unexpected flight and subsequent capture, the reaction was swift and furious. Hitler, a man who valued control and absolute loyalty, felt deeply betrayed. He saw Hess's mission not as an act of courage, but as a reckless and delusional blunder that jeopardized Germany's position in the war. Hess, who had once been one of Hitler's closest confidants, was now publicly disowned by the very leader he revered. Hitler's first move was to denounce Hess as mentally unstable. Nazi propaganda quickly spun a story portraying Hess as a misguided fanatic who had suffered a psychological breakdown. The regime suggested that his interest in astrology, mysticism, and spiritual philosophy had led him down a path of irrational thinking and had finally driven him to a state of madness. By labeling Hess as mentally unfit, Hitler and his ministers distanced the Nazi Party from the fiasco, portraying it as the tragic misadventure of an otherwise loyal, but mentally ill, follower. The propaganda machine in Germany worked overtime to erase Hess's legacy from the Nazi narrative. The press was ordered to downplay his significance in the party, and his name was systematically removed from Nazi records and historical accounts. Nazi officials circulated rumors suggesting that Hess had been secretly planning his mission for months, completely independent of Hitler's knowledge. To the German public, the message was clear: Hess was a traitor, an embarrassment, and no longer part of the Nazi hierarchy. Meanwhile, in Britain, Hess was an unusual and highly valuable prisoner. British intelligence officers and military officials were eager to understand his motivations and, potentially, gain insights into the inner workings of the Nazi regime. However, Hess proved to be a difficult and often frustrating subject. He was alternately cooperative and evasive, shifting between lucid discussions and erratic, sometimes paranoid, outbursts. British psychiatrists assessed him extensively, unsure if his behavior was genuine or an attempt to mislead his captors. During his interrogations, Hess insisted that he had come to Britain with a genuine offer of peace. He repeated his belief that Germany and Britain should join forces against the Soviet Union, which he described as the true threat to Europe. To his captors, however, Hess's ideas seemed out of touch with reality. The British government was fully committed to the Allied cause and had no intention of negotiating with Nazi Germany. They viewed Hess's mission as little more than a desperate, delusional gamble by a man increasingly detached from the brutal reality of war. Hess's behavior in captivity only reinforced this perception. He became increasingly withdrawn, refusing to discuss military matters or offer any useful intelligence. He often rambled about astrology, destiny, and his loyalty to Hitler, though he now saw himself as something of a martyr for the Nazi cause. His isolation from both his fellow Nazis and the outside world took a toll on his mental state, and his erratic behavior led British officials to conclude that he was indeed unstable. Back in Germany, Hess's former colleagues were quick to distance themselves from him. Figures like Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler, who had once worked closely with Hess, now saw an opportunity to consolidate their own power in the Nazi hierarchy. Göring, in particular, seized the chance to position himself as Hitler's most trusted advisor, filling the gap left by Hess's sudden departure. Hess, once a respected figure in the Nazi leadership, had become a pariah, a scapegoat whose fall from grace served as a warning to others in Hitler's circle. As the months passed, it became clear that Hess would remain in British custody for the foreseeable future. The British government had little interest in releasing him or treating him as an envoy. Instead, they saw value in keeping him as a high-profile prisoner of war. For Hess, the realization that his mission had failed was devastating. The man who had once stood at Hitler's side, dreaming of a united Germany and Britain, now faced the reality of indefinite imprisonment in enemy territory, his hopes of diplomacy reduced to ashes. The aftermath of Hess's mission was one of both personal tragedy and political ruin. His misguided attempt at peace had cost him his position, his influence, and his freedom. Hess had embarked on his flight believing he would be a hero, a peacemaker who would be remembered as the man who brought Britain and Germany together. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the dangers of fanaticism and delusion, and a reminder that in the brutal world of Nazi politics, loyalty was only as strong as one's usefulness to Hitler. The man who once held the title of Deputy Führer was now a lonely prisoner, marked as a traitor by his own leader and abandoned by the cause he had dedicated his life to. Hess's story, already strange and tragic, would only grow more complex in the years to come as he faced a future defined by solitude, interrogation, and the bitter awareness that his loyalty to Hitler had led him down a path from which there would be no return. In British custody, Rudolf Hess became a figure of fascination and mystery, a high-ranking Nazi official held captive by his former enemy. The British government understood the symbolic value of holding such an important prisoner but was unsure what to make of his mission and mental state. Hess alternated between moments of clarity, in which he calmly discussed his vision for an Anglo-German alliance, and episodes of paranoia and delusion. His erratic behavior puzzled his interrogators, leading some to question whether he was truly unstable or merely attempting to mislead his captors. After his capture, Hess was transported to various locations for questioning, including the Tower of London, where he spent time under the watchful eye of British intelligence. The British sought any valuable information that Hess might possess about Hitler, Nazi strategy, or the German military. However, Hess proved a frustrating subject. He was reluctant to reveal details about Nazi operations, often dodging questions with vague answers or falling back on philosophical musings. When asked about Hitler, Hess expressed unwavering loyalty, speaking of him with a reverence that bordered on fanaticism. He seemed oblivious to the reality that his mission had been deemed a failure by both the British and the Nazis. As time passed, Hess's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began to experience hallucinations, claiming that he was being poisoned and that British agents were plotting against him. He grew distrustful of his food, convinced it was laced with harmful substances. These outbursts worried his captors, who feared that Hess's mental condition was deteriorating. British psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate him, and the diagnosis was inconclusive. Some believed he was suffering from genuine psychological distress, while others suspected that he was feigning madness to avoid serious interrogation. In addition to his paranoia, Hess showed an obsession with astrology and numerology, often referring to cosmic forces and mystical signs. He expressed a belief that his mission was part of a greater destiny, insisting that he had been guided by forces beyond his control. This spiritual fixation, which had already set him apart from other Nazi leaders, now became a central feature of his daily life. To British intelligence, his fascination with the supernatural only added to his unpredictability, making him a more perplexing figure. Despite his deteriorating mental state, Hess continued to believe that his mission to Britain could still bear fruit. He frequently asked for an audience with British officials, hoping that someone would take his message seriously and agree to negotiate a peace between Britain and Germany. He seemed unable to accept that his peace mission had failed completely and that the British government had no interest in collaborating with the Nazis. To Hess, this rejection was not only a personal defeat but also a betrayal of what he believed to be a shared destiny between Germany and Britain. Meanwhile, in Germany, the official response to Hess's imprisonment grew harsher. Hitler, furious at Hess's actions, had effectively erased him from the Nazi Party's narrative. Hess was declared an enemy of the Reich, and his name was stricken from Nazi records. Propaganda emphasized that Hess had acted independently, without authorization from Hitler, and that his actions were not representative of the Nazi Party. The man who had once been Hitler's most loyal supporter was now viewed as a delusional outcast, abandoned by the regime he had served. Months turned into years, and Hess's captivity became a study in isolation and psychological decline. The British continued to hold him, unwilling to release such a prominent Nazi official but also unsure of what to do with him. Hess's health fluctuated, with periods of physical weakness and mental instability becoming more frequent. His days were largely solitary, spent either under guard or in the company of medical professionals who observed him closely. Occasionally, he was allowed to write letters to his family, though these were heavily censored. Despite the bleak conditions of his captivity, Hess clung to his beliefs. He maintained that his mission was a noble one, refusing to accept that he had been misguided or that his loyalty to Hitler had been misplaced. In his mind, he had done what he thought was best for Germany and the future of Europe. This conviction gave him a sense of purpose, however fragile, even as his isolation and deteriorating health took their toll. The years of imprisonment would ultimately transform Hess from a powerful figure in Nazi Germany to a tragic and almost forgotten prisoner of war. The once loyal deputy was now a solitary man, haunted by his own ideals and the reality that his grand vision had turned into an international spectacle. As he languished in British custody, Hesse's story became less about the war and more about the personal cost of fanaticism and misguided ambition, a man who had aimed to change history, only to find himself condemned to watch it unfold from the confines of a prison cell. With the end of World War II in 1945, the Allies faced the monumental task of bringing Nazi leaders to justice for their roles in orchestrating the atrocities of the war. Rudolf Hess, still held in British custody, was transferred to Nuremberg, Germany, to stand trial before the International Military Tribunal. Alongside other high-ranking Nazi officials, Hess was indicted on charges that included crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. During the trial, Hesse's mental state became a focal point. He appeared detached and indifferent, at times claiming to have amnesia regarding his actions during the Nazi regime. His behavior oscillated between moments of apparent confusion and episodes where he displayed a keen understanding of the proceedings. Psychiatrists evaluated him extensively, ultimately deeming him fit to stand trial despite his erratic demeanor. Hess attempted to use his flight to Britain as a defense, arguing that his intention had been to secure peace and prevent further bloodshed. He contended that he was not involved in the planning or execution of the war's most heinous crimes, particularly those related to the Holocaust. However, the prosecution maintained that Hess had been an integral part of the Nazi leadership, contributing to the regime's aggressive policies and expansionist objectives. On October 1, 1946, the tribunal delivered its verdict. Rudolf Hess was found guilty on 2 counts, crimes against peace and conspiracy to commit crimes against peace. He was acquitted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, largely due to the lack of direct evidence linking him to the operational aspects of the regime's most brutal actions. Nevertheless, the court sentenced him to life imprisonment, recognizing his significant role in supporting and enabling Hitler's aggressive policies. Hess was incarcerated in Spandau prison in Berlin, which was administered jointly by the 4 Allied powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. The prison housed 7 Nazi war criminals, but as the years passed, prisoners were released or died, leaving Hess as the sole inmate by 1966. His confinement was marked by strict routines and isolation. The Allies rotated responsibility for guarding the prison on a monthly basis, ensuring that no single nation had unilateral control over Hess's detention. Throughout his imprisonment, Hess remained a figure of controversy. He refused to renounce his allegiance to Nazi ideology and showed little remorse for his actions or the suffering caused by the regime he served. Various humanitarian groups and individuals petitioned for his release on compassionate grounds, especially as he advanced in age and his health declined. However, these appeals were consistently vetoed, particularly by the Soviet Union, which insisted that Hess serve his full sentence. Life in Spandau was monotonous and solitary. Hess occupied his time by reading, writing, and tending a small garden within the prison grounds. He had limited contact with the outside world, allowed only occasional visits from family members under strict supervision. Despite the isolation, Hess remained steadfast in his beliefs, a solitary relic of a defeated regime. On August 17, 1987, Rudolf Hess died at the age of 93. The official report stated that he committed suicide by hanging himself with an electrical cord in a summer house within the prison garden. His death sparked immediate controversy and speculation. Given his advanced age and physical limitations, some questioned the plausibility of suicide, suggesting that foul play might have been involved. Conspiracy theories circulated, alleging that Hess had been murdered to prevent him from revealing sensitive information or as a final act of retribution. An autopsy conducted by British authorities confirmed the cause of death as suicide, and subsequent investigations found no evidence to support claims of assassination. Nevertheless, the circumstances of his death continued to fuel debate and suspicion among conspiracy theorists and extremist groups. Following his death, Hess was buried in a family plot in Wunsiedel, Bavaria. His grave became a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis and far-right extremists, prompting authorities to take action. In 2011, to prevent the site from serving as a rallying point for extremist activities, Hesse's remains were exhumed, cremated, and scattered at sea in an undisclosed location. Rudolf Hesse's life is a complex tapestry of fanaticism, misguided idealism, and the catastrophic consequences of absolute loyalty to a tyrannical regime. His audacious solo flight, intended as a bold step toward peace, instead led to his lifelong imprisonment and historical infamy. Hesse's story serves as a stark reminder of the perils of blind allegiance and the profound impact that individual actions can have on the course of history. Through his unwavering commitment to Nazi ideology and his ill-fated mission, Hesse became both a symbol of the regime's inner workings and a cautionary tale of obsession overriding reason. His legacy is a testament to the depths of conviction that can drive a person to extraordinary lengths, and the tragic outcomes that can result when such convictions are tied to destructive and oppressive ideologies. Rudolf Hesse's flight to Britain, an event that he envisioned as a noble mission for peace, ultimately became one of the strangest episodes of World War II and left an indelible mark on his legacy. Rather than achieving diplomatic success or historical recognition as a peacemaker, Hesse's journey branded him as a figure of ridicule, betrayal, and misplaced loyalty. Over time, historians, psychologists, and even conspiracy theorists have scrutinized his actions, trying to understand the motivations and mindset that led him to such a reckless course. In the years following his death, Hesse's story has remained the subject of debate and intrigue. His flight, which initially seemed like a bizarre, isolated incident, has been analyzed as a reflection of the inner workings and fractures within the Nazi regime. Some historians argue that his mission reveals an idealistic side of Hesse that was profoundly at odds with the ruthless, militaristic ambitions of his Nazi peers. Others view his actions as evidence of a profound mental disturbance, suggesting that his fixation on astrology, mysticism, and destiny had led him down a path of delusion. Psychologically, Hesse is often portrayed as an example of what happens when fanaticism merges with a lack of critical self-awareness. His unshakable belief in Hitler and his mystical ideas about Germany's destiny clouded his judgment, leading him to act without considering the harsh realities of war and international politics. His loyalty to Hitler, which had once been a source of strength within the Nazi hierarchy, became his downfall when it drove him to act independently, contrary to the party's objectives. Hesse's journey from deputy Führer to isolated prisoner reflects the tragic outcome of someone who placed ideology above all else, sacrificing his freedom and reputation for a misguided vision of peace. In a broader sense, Hesse's legacy has been shaped by the political climate surrounding his imprisonment and eventual death. His life sentence in Spandau prison made him a symbol of enduring punishment for Nazi leaders, and his continued incarceration into old age fueled calls for clemency, particularly among right-wing groups. His death under mysterious circumstances sparked conspiracy theories, with some claiming that he was murdered to silence any potentially embarrassing secrets about the Nazi leadership or Allied powers. Hesse's grave in Wunsiedel, which became a rallying point for neo-Nazi groups, posed an ongoing challenge for German authorities who sought to prevent his memory from being glorified by extremist movements. When his remains were exhumed and scattered at sea in 2011, it symbolized an effort to erase the physical remnants of his legacy, distancing him from any place of honor or pilgrimage. This act of removing Hesse's remains also underscored the determination of modern Germany to confront and reject its dark past, refusing to let figures like Hesse serve as martyrs for future generations of extremists. Today, Rudolf Hesse stands as a historical enigma, man driven by an intense belief in his purpose but forever defined by his profound misjudgments. His life and actions serve as both a curiosity and a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of blind allegiance and ideological fanaticism. Hesse's legacy is often overshadowed by the greater atrocities of the Nazi regime, yet his story remains a unique chapter in the history of World War II, highlighting the personal and political consequences of a man who sought peace on his own terms and instead found a life of isolation, disgrace, and tragedy. In the end, Rudolf Hesse's life is remembered not for the peace he attempted to achieve, but for the path of delusion and futility he chose to follow. His story is a testament to the perils of single-minded loyalty to a destructive cause, illustrating how even those who consider themselves patriots can be misled by ideology, ultimately leaving behind a legacy shaped by both human folly and historical infamy. Long after his death, Rudolf Hess's life and actions continued to cast a long, complex shadow over post-war Europe. As the years passed, he came to symbolize more than just a Nazi official with misguided ambitions. His story became emblematic of the ideological fanaticism and psychological consequences that characterized the inner circles of the Third Reich. Unlike many other Nazi leaders, Hesse's trajectory was unique, combining a fervent nationalism, mysticism, and misplaced idealism that ultimately led him to self-destructive isolation. The symbolic value of Hess as a prisoner, especially during his decades-long incarceration in Spandau, was immense. His continued confinement, despite his relative detachment from the most brutal atrocities of the Nazi regime, underscored the Allied commitment to prevent any resurgence of fascist ideology. Hesse's imprisonment was as much a practical measure as it was a political statement. The Allies wanted to remind the world that the remnants of Nazi leadership would never be allowed to regain power, no matter how remote the threat. Hess became a living reminder of the consequences of allegiance to an authoritarian and genocidal regime. After his death, the exhumation and scattering of Hesse's remains became a poignant conclusion to the symbolic hold he had on history. With neo-Nazi groups attempting to appropriate Hesse's memory as a martyr for their causes, the decision to disperse his ashes at sea was a deliberate effort to erase any physical place of homage. The German government's decisive action was emblematic of its ongoing dedication to suppress the Nazi legacy and prevent historical revisionism. This action closed a chapter of Nazi symbolism and illustrated modern Germany's commitment to confronting and dismantling remnants of its darkest history. Hesse's story also left an enduring impression on historians and scholars who sought to understand the inner dynamics of the Nazi hierarchy. Unlike other high-ranking Nazis, Hess lacked the ruthless pragmatism or power-seeking ambitions that drove figures like Himmler, Göring, or Goebbels. Instead, his fervent loyalty and fixation on ideology led him to make decisions that others might have deemed illogical or even suicidal. For many historians, Hess serves as an example of the dangers of ideological obsession, demonstrating how a seemingly rational individual can become engulfed by fanaticism, leading to both personal and historical ruin. Psychologically, Hesse's case has been examined as a study of how loyalty can distort judgment. His unwavering belief in Hitler's vision for Germany bordered on the pathological, showing how blind allegiance can override self-preservation. This fanatical devotion, combined with his interest in mysticism, created a worldview where destiny and ideology merged, ultimately leading him to act in ways that defied common sense. Hesse's life is a tragic reminder of how even well-intentioned loyalty can become dangerous when it is disconnected from reality and grounded instead in ideology. In the context of World War II, Hesse's story highlights a broader truth about the Nazi regime, that, behind the brutality and authoritarianism, there was also an element of instability and irrationality that permeated its leadership. His flight to Britain was emblematic of this irrationality, a quixotic attempt that underscored the regime's contradictions. While the Nazi leadership projected an image of discipline and order, Hesse's story shows the underlying chaos and delusions that often drove its members. For students of history, Rudolf Hess remains a figure whose story raises more questions than it answers. His life prompts reflection on the nature of loyalty, the perils of ideology, and the human capacity for self-deception. He serves as a cautionary example of how loyalty to a destructive cause can erode not only one's morality but also one's grasp on reality, leading to choices that ultimately lead to isolation and ruin. Hesse's legacy, while minor in comparison to the broader horrors of the Nazi regime, reminds us that the scars of history are not only shaped by the architects of atrocities but also by those who, through their loyalty and delusion, enabled them. In his quest for peace on his own terms, Hess became an unwilling prisoner of his own ideology, leaving behind a legacy not of the unity he sought but of the isolation, obsession, and the tragic consequences of a life devoted to a deeply flawed vision. In the years leading up to his death, Rudolf Hess's life at Spandau prison became one of extreme isolation and quiet endurance. By the mid-1960s, Hess was the sole remaining prisoner in Spandau, with all other Nazi officials either released or deceased. As a single inmate in a vast, echoing prison under the rotation of Allied guards from the United States, United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, Hess's existence became a strange and costly symbol of retribution for Nazi war crimes. Each month, the prison's administration changed hands, and the guard rotation continued, ensuring that Hess remained under tight international watch. The costs and resources needed to maintain a massive prison facility for one man became a topic of controversy. Critics argued that Hess's detention had become symbolic to the point of absurdity, a relic of Allied retribution that no longer served a practical purpose. Supporters of Hess's continued imprisonment, however, saw his life sentence as a necessary reminder of Nazi crimes and a symbol that the atrocities committed by the regime would never be forgotten or forgiven. During his final years, Hess's health began to decline significantly. Isolated, aging, and without the company of other prisoners, he became increasingly frail. Yet, despite various appeals for clemency based on his age and deteriorating health, his release was consistently blocked, primarily by the Soviet Union, which argued that Hess's crimes warranted life imprisonment without compromise. Hess remained a source of ideological tension, with the Soviet Union standing firm on his continued imprisonment as a statement against any potential resurgence of Nazi sentiment. In his solitude, Hess's thoughts reportedly turned inward, becoming increasingly introspective. He kept meticulous notes and records and spent his days gardening, reading, and writing letters to his family. Despite the passage of time, he remained steadfast in his loyalty to the memory of Hitler, refusing to renounce the ideology he had followed so fervently. This refusal made clemency or even limited freedoms impossible to consider, as Hess himself showed no signs of remorse or ideological change. On August 17, 1987, Rudolf Hess was found dead in a small summerhouse within the Spandau prison yard. Official reports concluded that he had taken his own life by hanging himself with an electrical cord, an act that shocked many and ignited a flurry of conspiracy theories. Given Hess's advanced age and physical condition, some speculated that it would have been difficult for him to commit suicide unaided. Rumors of foul play began to circulate, with theories suggesting that he was murdered to prevent him from disclosing sensitive wartime information or to avoid potential embarrassment for the Allies in the face of new political tensions. However, multiple investigations conducted by British authorities found no evidence of external involvement, affirming suicide as the official cause of death. Following his death, Hess's remains were interred in a family plot in Wunsiedel, Bavaria. For several years, his grave became a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazi groups and far-right extremists who saw Hess as a martyr, leading to annual gatherings and commemorations that worried German authorities. This growing association with extremist groups led to a controversial decision in 2011 to exhume Hess's remains, cremate them, and scatter his ashes at sea. The move was intended to prevent his grave from becoming a rallying point for neo-Nazi activity and to close the physical chapter of his legacy once and for all. The legacy of Rudolf Hess and his life sentence at Spandau remains a complex and contentious topic. For some, his continued imprisonment was a powerful reminder of justice, a symbol of the unwavering accountability for the crimes of the Nazi regime. For others, Hess's solitary confinement became a point of controversy, with arguments that his punishment had long outlived its original purpose. The exhumation and scattering of his ashes underscored modern Germany's commitment to preventing any resurgence of far-right extremism, an acknowledgement of the dark history that figures like Hess represented. In historical reflection, Hess's story has become a symbol of fanaticism and misguided idealism, a reminder of how devotion to a cause, when detached from moral and ethical grounding, can lead to catastrophic consequences. His life illustrates the dangers of unyielding loyalty to destructive ideologies, the personal ruin that such fanaticism can bring, and the deep scars left on history by those who enable tyranny. Today, Hess's legacy remains a footnote in the larger history of the Third Reich, but his story endures as a stark example of ideological blindness and the tragic end that awaits those who follow such paths to the bitter end. The story of Rudolf Hess, from deputy Führer of Nazi Germany to isolated prisoner in Spandau, serves as a multifaceted lesson on loyalty, ideology, and the dangers of blind faith in a destructive cause. His life, characterized by fervent nationalism and a deep, unwavering loyalty to Hitler, reveals the complexity of personal and political motivations within the Nazi regime. Unlike many of his counterparts, Hess's dedication was not rooted in the lust for power or material gain, rather, it was fueled by a fanaticism that blurred the line between ideology and personal conviction. Hess's failed peace mission to Britain, once viewed as a bizarre, isolated incident, has since become a case study in political and psychological misjudgment. His solo flight is often interpreted as a tragic illustration of how a distorted worldview and obsessive loyalty can drive an individual to make disastrous decisions. Hess's insistence on the notion that Britain and Germany were natural allies blinded him to the reality of the Nazi regime's atrocities and to the unlikelihood of Britain aligning itself with a government bent on conquest. In this sense, Hess's mission reflects the profound detachment of the Nazi leadership from reality, a detachment driven by ideology, propaganda, and self-deception. Historically, Hess's life also offers insights into the inner dynamics of the Nazi hierarchy. As Hitler's trusted deputy, Hess had once wielded influence within the Nazi Party, helping to shape the ideological core of the regime. Yet, as the party became increasingly focused on war and conquest, Hess's role diminished, and his influence waned. His later years were marked by an obsession with mysticism, astrology, and the notion of destiny, a path that ultimately isolated him from the pragmatism of other Nazi leaders. Hess's fascination with esoteric beliefs highlights how a charismatic leader like Hitler could attract followers with varying motivations, from pragmatic ambition to pure ideological fervor. In the broader context of post-war justice, Hess's life sentence in Spandau stands as a testament to the determination of the Allies to hold Nazi leaders accountable. His continued imprisonment, even as an elderly and isolated figure, was both a practical consequence and a symbolic one, a message that the horrors of the Nazi regime would not be forgotten or excused. The controversy surrounding his prolonged confinement underscores the complexities of justice and reconciliation in the aftermath of atrocities. Hess's imprisonment serves as a reminder that accountability for crimes of this magnitude must be enduring, that even the passage of decades cannot erase the responsibility for such dark chapters in history. The conspiracy theories that emerged after Hess's death in 1987, questioning whether he had truly taken his own life or if there had been foul play, highlight the lasting mystique and intrigue surrounding his legacy. His death marked the end of an era, but it also opened a new chapter of speculation, with some interpreting his solitary confinement and eventual death as symbolic of the unresolved tensions of World War II. These theories, though widely debunked, reflect the enduring fascination with the Nazi leadership and the psychological allure of understanding figures whose actions defy conventional logic. In the modern day, Rudolf Hess's legacy continues to serve as a cautionary tale. For historians, his story provides a window into the psychological and ideological landscape of the Third Reich, illustrating how loyalty to a tyrannical leader and blind devotion to an ideology can erode judgment, morality, and ultimately, a person's humanity. For Germany, Hess's legacy is a part of the difficult process of acknowledging and atoning for the atrocities of the past, a reminder of the extremism that once held sway and of the importance of vigilance against the re-emergence of such ideologies. Ultimately, Rudolf Hess's life is a testament to the dangers of surrendering one's moral compass to a destructive ideology. His story, from Hitler's loyal deputy to the last prisoner of Spandau, is both a historical curiosity and a moral lesson. Hess's unwavering belief in the Nazi vision, his tragic mission for peace, and his long, solitary imprisonment underscore the perils of fanaticism and the heavy toll it exacts on both individuals and societies. His legacy, shrouded in the complexities of war, justice, and memory, remains a stark reminder that history's darkest moments are often perpetuated not only by those who lead but also by those who follow without question. Rudolf Hess's life and actions leave behind a legacy that is difficult to unravel and even harder to categorize. He was neither a mastermind of Nazi military strategy nor a bureaucratic orchestrator of genocide. Instead, Hess was a true believer, a man whose loyalty to Hitler and the Nazi ideology transcended rationality, ultimately leading him down a path of isolation, failure, and disgrace. His misguided attempt to broker peace through an unauthorized mission to Britain, a decision that cost him his freedom and his place in the Nazi hierarchy, has made him a symbol of both the strange idealism and the deep-seated fanaticism that pervaded Hitler's closest circle. As a historical figure, Hess embodies the dangers of unyielding ideology and the lengths to which belief, when untethered from reality, can push a person. His legacy stands as a cautionary tale about the costs of blind allegiance, illustrating how loyalty, when placed in service of a malignant cause, can lead to both personal ruin and historical infamy. Hess's life warns against the seductive allure of ideology that promises purpose but demands moral compromise, highlighting how even those with seemingly noble intentions can be led astray when they surrender their own judgment. In the years since his death, Rudolf Hess has remained a divisive figure. For some, he is viewed as a tragic individual who believed himself to be acting for the good of Germany, even as he contributed to one of the darkest regimes in human history. For others, Hess is a stark reminder of the dangers of fanaticism, a man who failed to see the reality of his own actions and who helped enable a regime responsible for unimaginable suffering. His story serves as both a curiosity in the narrative of World War II and a deep exploration of the psychology of extremism and unwavering loyalty. In modern Germany, Hess's legacy is not celebrated, but it is remembered as part of a national commitment to confront and understand the roots of the Nazi period, in order to ensure that history does not repeat itself. His life and death have been interpreted as a warning about the susceptibility of people to authoritarianism, propaganda, and the seductive appeal of belonging to a cause that promises destiny and purpose. The dismantling of Hess's grave in 2011 and the scattering of his ashes at sea symbolize Germany's rejection of his ideology and its refusal to allow his memory to become a rallying point for neo-Nazism or extremist groups. This decision, a final step in severing Hess's legacy from any place of reverence, reflects a commitment to confronting the lessons of the past without permitting its symbols to fuel dangerous ideals. Rudolf Hess's life and mission remain an enduring lesson in the dangers of unchecked ideology and the consequences of a loyalty that blinds rather than inspires. His story is an uncomfortable but necessary reminder of how individuals, no matter how seemingly detached from power, can play a role in the tragedies of history by surrendering their moral agency to a destructive cause. For future generations, Hess's tale serves as both a historical lesson and a moral imperative, a call to remain vigilant against extremism, to question the allure of any ideology that promises purpose at the cost of humanity, and to recognize that the path to ruin is often paved with the certainty of conviction.